Robert Peterson had spent a lifetime making chaos sound real. Now all he wanted was silence. The wind whispered through the Douglas firs surrounding the cabin, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and pine needles. Morning light slanted across the porch where Robert stood, cradling a ceramic mug filled with black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just bitter and hot, the way he liked it. From inside the house, soft jazz drifted through the screen door, mingling with the crisp Colorado air. It was late October, and the fall colors were at their peak, fiery reds and amber golds framing the ridgeline like a postcard. Inside, Sarah hummed quietly as she arranged fresh mums in a weathered tin bucket. Her hands moved slower these days, and Robert watched her from the kitchen window, noting the slight tremble in her fingers. She still wore that wide-brimmed gardening hat he'd bought for her years ago in Taos, even though it had faded almost to gray. It suited her. She moved among the raised beds with purpose, testing the soil, checking her lavender and rosemary, ignoring the persistent ache in her joints. Gardening was her therapy, a way to still feel useful, still feel rooted. Sarah had once said, "This is the kind of peace that heals." And Robert believed it. After 35 years working in studios where deadlines screamed louder than actors and everything was urgent, he had traded it all for this: peace, pine trees, and a woman who still smiled at him like it was 1987. The radio in the kitchen crackled as the local AM station came back from the forecast. Highs in the 50s, possible frost tonight. The host mentioned something about an upcoming community meeting, but Robert tuned it out. HOA meetings had never been his thing, not because he didn't care, but because Sarah said he got that look when bureaucrats talked too much. He retreated into his small workshop tucked behind the main cabin. The place smelled like cedar shavings and solder. Old equipment lined the shelves: analog tape decks, modular synths, ribbon mics. He was restoring a 1960s mixing board just for fun. As he leaned over the circuit, adjusting a grounding wire, he heard the screen door open. "I brought the newsletter," Sarah called. "Looks like the HOA's got plans again." He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped into the kitchen where Sarah had spread the folded pamphlet across the table. The headline read, "Exciting Seasonal Enhancements. Community Beautification Ahead." Robert picked it up. Typical HOA fluff. A few lines about new signage, lighting, maybe some winter decorations. He skimmed past mentions of enhanced connectivity and improved access for recreation, but nothing jumped out. That phrase there, connectivity improvement, what do you think it means? Sarah asked, sliding a pie into the oven. Sounds like they're putting in a new router. Or a cable line, Robert muttered. Either way, nothing they haven't meddled in before. The next morning, while Sarah was pruning the lavender bush, Robert decided to head into town for supplies. He parked outside the mountain diner just as the lunch crowd was thinning. The place was quiet, red vinyl booths, a chalkboard menu with half the items wiped off, and two old-timers sipping coffee by the window. Robert sat near the back and ordered his usual black coffee and a slice of apple pie. He brought a copy of the Pine Ridge Gazette from the rack, but barely skimmed it. That's when he heard it. "Yeah, they say they'll have the North Ridge open by New Year's," one of the old men said. "Phase 1's already staked." "Chairlift, huh?" "Didn't think we needed one," the other replied. "But Diane's got that Aspen background. Thinks she's still building ski resorts." Robert looked up. He didn't join the conversation, just listened. That afternoon he made a stop at the hardware store, picked up a new spool of coaxial cable, and returned home just before dusk. The golden light made the cabin glow like something from a painting. Sarah waved at him from the porch, but there was something in her face, something tentative. "I noticed some orange flags in the back lot," she said as he stepped out of the truck. "You think they're part of that connectivity project?" Robert didn't answer right away. He walked past the garden beds, past the edge of the split-rail fence, and into the trees. The ground was soft beneath his boots. Pine needles blanketed the soil, muffling his steps. And there they were, survey flags, thin, bright, fluttering in the breeze. He followed them slowly. The line they marked ran at an angle, too precise to be random, too direct to be accidental. Then he saw it. One of the stakes was driven deep into the earth, just inches from the edge of Sarah's flower bed. The soil there was dark and soft, still moist from yesterday's watering. A single daffodil bulb poked up nearby, unaware that its world might soon be altered. Robert crouched beside the stake. He touched the plastic ribbon gently, as if it might whisper its purpose. From the porch behind him, Sarah's voice cut through the silence. "Rob, why are there flags on our land?" The ground had been marked. Now the sky would be claimed too. The frost hadn't lifted yet when Robert pulled on his flannel jacket and stepped outside. A brittle wind crept through the evergreens, and the clouds above Pine Ridge Estates hung heavy and gray. The garden beds sat quiet, dusted with a pale film of ice. Sarah had stayed in, her knees bothering her more since the cold set in. She'd tried to joke about it, saying maybe the HOA would install heated sidewalks next. But the strain in her voice said more than the words. "They're not building anything over us, are they?" she'd asked, her hand brushing his on the porch rail. He hadn't answered, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Not yet. The HOA office was located in the same beige stucco building as the dental clinic and the UPS drop box. Robert pushed open the glass door and stepped into a room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and printer toner. Behind a desk stacked with file folders and paper signs reading things like "Community First," sat a young woman with tightly pulled hair and a headset tucked behind one ear. "Good morning," Robert said, removing his gloves. "I'd like to ask about the survey flags placed along our southern boundary line." The woman blinked. "You'll want to speak with Mrs. Reynolds." "I tried calling. No one returned my message." "She's in meetings today," the receptionist said, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I can leave another note for her." Robert gave a patient nod, but his eyes didn't leave hers. The young woman cleared her throat, tapped a few keys, then stood. "There is a community information session tomorrow morning at 10, she offered, "at the lodge. That might be a good opportunity to ask questions directly." 10 in the morning? On a Tuesday? She smiled apologetically. It was the only time the board could coordinate. He nodded again, this time more slowly, and left. The next morning, the sun barely cracked the horizon by the time Robert arrived at the community center. The lodge stood at the edge of the woods, built from artificial timber and enthusiasm, its main hall filled mostly with folding chairs and a smell of dust. Only 8 people sat scattered around the room, mostly retirees or folks who worked from home. A pot of lukewarm coffee steamed quietly near the back next to a tray of stale donut holes. Diane Reynolds entered precisely at 10, clipboard in hand, lips painted in a shade of confidence that didn't waver. She wore a tailored navy suit and a delicate gold pin shaped like a snowflake. Her heels clicked like punctuation marks on the polished floor. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "Today we're sharing preliminary plans for an exciting new project that will benefit the entire Pine Ridge community." She gestured to the easel beside her, where a glossy rendering of the neighborhood had been mounted. Across the drawing, a red dashed line curved from the upper left, North Ridge, down across several lots and into the lower valley near the clubhouse. Robert leaned forward. "This is our proposed chairlift," Diane said, tapping the drawing. "It will enhance recreational access during winter, connect trails, and increase property values throughout Pine Ridge." He followed the red line with his eyes. It cut straight across the southern stretch, right over his cabin. "We're very proud of this initiative," Diane continued, her tone breezy. "It's part of a vision for Pine Ridge that balances rustic charm with modern amenities." Robert raised his hand. Diane paused, her expression barely shifting. "Yes, Mr. Peterson. Robert Peterson. This lift appears to run directly over my home. I haven't received any notice, nor was this ever discussed in a public forum." Diane gave a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Peterson, Section 37C of the HOA bylaws allows for airspace easements in service of community infrastructure. Notification letters were sent last April. Perhaps you missed yours." "I reviewed the bylaws when we bought our property. There was no Section 37C. It was included in last year's administrative update," she said. "Unanimously approved by the board. All members received the amendment packet." Robert's jaw tensed. "Your input is appreciated," she added, with the tone of someone closing a door. "But the board has already approved this project unanimously. We're simply sharing the good news today." Someone clapped near the coffee table. Another attendee murmured something about how it might be good for the kids. Robert glanced around the room. No one looked back at him. After the meeting, as people shuffled out, a voice stopped him near the exit. "Be careful who you challenge here," the man said quietly. Robert turned to see a tall man in a brown wool coat, glasses tucked into his breast pocket. "Tom Andrews," the man said, offering a hand. "Retired judge." Robert shook it. "Her husband's firm is doing the construction," Tom murmured. "And her brother? He's on the county commission." Robert blinked. "Just thought you should know." That evening, after dinner, he sat at the dining table with a lamp on and the amendment packet spread before him. Sarah was in the other room, curled up on the couch with a heating pad across her knees. Rain tapped softly against the windows. He flipped page after page, rereading every clause, every header. Nothing. No Section 37C. No mention of airspace easements. No record of the chairlift. Just fine print, boilerplate, and empty reassurances about preserving the spirit of Pine Ridge. He held the last page in his hand for a long time, then slowly set it down and reached for his coffee. The mug sat cold. That night, Robert pulls out the amendment packet he signed last year and finds no Section 37C. The system was built to inspire joy. He would teach it to whisper fear. By mid-November, the trees had shed their last color, leaving behind bare arms reaching into the gray sky. A soft layer of snow clung to the pine needles and rooftops, just enough to hush the landscape. Thanksgiving was close, but the usual warmth that filled Robert's cabin this time of year had been drowned by the whine of machinery and the constant beep of trucks in reverse. Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring at the oven. The pumpkin pie she had managed to prepare, despite her aching wrists, had sunken in the middle. It wasn't the pie that bothered her. It was the vibration from the compactor that had rattled the counter halfway through baking. She didn't say anything to Robert, but he saw it in her eyes when she sat down without a word and looked out the frosted window. The morning before, she'd tried to prune the lavender. The lift support crews had pulled their trucks up too close, blocking access to her garden path. A tire print crossed through her patch of moss. She'd stood there for a moment, pruning shears limp in her hand, before turning and walking back into the house without finishing a single stem. Robert had filed 3 complaints that week, 2 through the HOA portal and 1 through the county's online forum. The HOA responded with an automated message thanking him for his ongoing engagement. The county didn't reply at all. That night, he walked out to the shed with a thermos of black coffee and didn't come back inside for hours. The shed had always been more than a hobby space. It was a retreat, a sanctuary of solder fumes and neatly coiled cables. Now it would be something more. On a notepad yellowed with age, Robert began sketching what he remembered from the original chairlift schematics he'd seen in Diane's presentation. He marked the path, estimated tower intervals, noted where the ride passed closest to his property. He stepped outside and began walking the perimeter, placing survey markers of his own. Instead of plastic flags, he used small stones and chalk marks on tree trunks, nothing anyone would notice. The system wouldn't be permanent. That was the point. It wouldn't harm anything, wouldn't touch the lift, wouldn't interfere with operations, wouldn't leave a mark. But it would leave an impression, a very specific one. He started with the sound profile of the lift itself. Using a parabolic microphone, he recorded the motor and cable noises from a distance, cataloging the frequencies into labeled files. Then he began building new layers: metal groans, low-frequency harmonic tension, sub-audible rumbling designed to create the sensation of instability. To most people, they'd be barely perceptible. But paired with the right context, windy weather, cold cables, open air, people's imaginations would do the rest. The hardware was more challenging. He mounted directional speakers into hollowed logs and beneath decorative rock features along his back tree line. Camouflaged, weatherproofed, calibrated to activate only when triggered manually. Robert tested the first sequence on himself. He rode the lift alone after hours, having quietly followed the Millers and slipped onto an empty chair as the last loop continued. Sarah waited below, her hand on the test switch inside the workshop. At first, the lift's mechanical hum was the only thing he heard. Then came the layered distortions, soft at first, then growing just enough to make him grip the side rail. The cables made no sound, but he could swear they flexed beneath him. The seat felt wrong, like it might tilt. He looked down. The trees blurred under him, the cabin roof framed in snow. And though he knew the sounds were his creation, a part of his brain, the old primitive part, believed them. He got off without speaking. The next afternoon, the Millers came to test the lift as part of the HOA's Early User Experience Group. Robert stood by his workbench, watching from the shadows behind the shed. He waited until their chair was midway above his property before flipping a small toggle. Nothing loud, just a layered murmur, something not quite there. The young woman tensed, glanced at her husband. He leaned forward. Both turned their heads. The chair passed, creaking softly. At the top of the hill, they stepped off with stiff shoulders, speaking quietly to the attendant. Robert turned off the system and walked back into the house. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee and stared out at the yard dusted in frost, Sarah stepped out onto the porch with a folded flyer in her hand. She looked puzzled, then concerned. She held it out to him, printed in bold green letters across the top. Grand opening. This Saturday. By the third ride, people stopped smiling on the chairlift. The air in Pine Ridge Estates that Saturday morning was crisp and sweet, laced with the scent of fir sap and warm cider. Evergreen boughs sagged gently under a dusting of snow, and a large banner stretched between two poles near the lodge entrance, read Pine Ridge Winterlift, Grand Opening Celebration. Below it, tables were set with cookies shaped like snowflakes, paper cups steaming with mulled cider, and HOA-branded ornaments in neat rows. Children chased each other through the snow, leaving crooked trails behind them, their laughter floating upward like birdsong. Couples took selfies in front of the lift station, while Diane Reynolds moved among them with the poise of a cruise director, her hands folded neatly in front of her tailored coat. She smiled, offered greetings, made sure no one lingered too long with questions. Robert stood further back near the edge of the woods, one hand resting on the trunk of a fir tree. From there, he had a clear view of the loading platform, the lift towers rising like metallic trees against the winter sky. Sarah had stayed home. Her knees were flaring again, and the noise made her restless. He'd kissed her forehead before leaving. "Just going to watch," he'd said. She didn't ask anything more. The first rotations went without incident. The chairs glided smoothly, the cables taut and singing their usual metallic whisper. Diane clapped softly as the first riders returned, declaring the experience exhilarating but peaceful. Robert said nothing. He waited until the third rotation before slipping his hand into the pocket of his wool coat and clicking the small remote nestled there. The directional speakers hidden along the tree line flickered to life. From the ground, everything remained normal. No feedback, no extra sound. Just the creak of chairs, the crunch of boots, the laughter of a nearby toddler attempting to build a lopsided snowman. But in the air, on the chairlift, things changed. A couple mid-span sat upright. The man turned his head sharply to the right. The woman gripped the safety bar and whispered something close to his ear. They looked around, searching for a source of the soft groaning they couldn't place. Robert tilted his head slightly. Another pair of riders approached the midpoint, just above his property line, and the speakers emitted a brief sequence of cable tension harmonics. Not loud, not obvious, but wrong. Wrong in the way a breath behind your ear feels when no one is there. By the time the fourth rotation completed, the first complaints began to trickle in. One rider mentioned hearing a deep knocking sound near the midsection. Another described a low rumble, like a bad bearing. The lift operator, a college student in a bright vest, nodded politely and wrote something on his clipboard, then went back to checking seat locks. Robert walked to the far side of the clearing and watched the Millers board a chair. Their expressions were tight, not smiling this time. As they passed the tree line, he adjusted the timing by a half-second. A delayed grind, followed by a high-frequency, metallic shriek, barely audible, but unmistakably wrong. By the time the Millers disembarked, they were pale. They didn't speak to the crowd, just looked at each other and left, holding hands a little tighter than before. Later, a man with a gray beard and a padded field jacket climbed onto a chair with his son and grandson. Robert recognized him, someone from the diner crowd, maybe retired military or maintenance. Halfway across the span, the speakers introduced a heavier sequence, layered harmonics suggesting tower flex, followed by intermittent bass pulses, calibrated to create a sensation of instability. The man looked straight down and pulled the emergency cord. The lift came to a full stop with a lurch, chairs swaying. People murmured. Children pointed. Diane strode forward immediately, giving instructions in a tone that had lost its shine. Staff moved to reassure the crowd, citing a false trigger and extreme caution from a passenger with good intentions. Technicians ran checks up and down the line. Nothing was wrong. Nothing ever was. Still, the incident cast a shadow. Some residents left early. Others stayed but avoided eye contact with the lift itself. It wasn't long before someone floated the idea of a confidence ride. Board members and key homeowners would ride together, smiling and waving, to prove the lift was safe. Diane agreed. An hour later, she and 3 board members boarded separate chairs. Cameras clicked, phones were raised. The lift operator forced a smile. Robert didn't activate the system right away. He waited until Diane's chair was just past the midpoint. Then he triggered the groan sequence, a low, aching sound like old metal under too much stress, followed by a short, sharp crack at irregular intervals. The treasurer's wife sat 2 chairs behind Diane. She began to cry. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just quietly, clutching the bar with white knuckles, tears spilling down her cheeks. When they reached the far station, she refused to get off. It took 2 staff members to help her down. Diane's smile never returned to her face that day. That evening, Robert returned home to find Sarah asleep on the couch, a book open across her chest. He moved quietly to the front door and picked up the mail. Among the envelopes was a flyer someone had taped to the community bulletin board and then photocopied, a grainy screen grab of a teenage girl on the lift, mouth open mid-scream, text overlaid in bold red, Ghost Chairlift of Pine Ridge. By morning, the video had 100,000 views. Fear did what lawsuits couldn't. The storm rolled in with the kind of wind that made the old pine trees creak, and the windows at Pine Ridge Community Hall shudder in their frames. Snowflakes swirled in tight circles across the parking lot, blown sideways by gusts that tugged at scarves and flung loose flyers down the sidewalk. Inside, the hall was packed tighter than it had been in years. Plastic chairs scraped against the linoleum floor. Wool coats and puffy jackets hung on the backs of chairs. The smell of snow-damp boots and percolated coffee filled the air. People murmured in hushed voices, glancing toward the front where Diane Reynolds sat behind the folding table used for HOA meetings, her expression carved from stone. Robert stood near the rear wall, hands in his pockets, his face calm. Sarah had stayed home, still recovering from another restless night. She'd said little over breakfast, only paused by the window and whispered, "Maybe they'll finally listen now." The meeting began with a half-hearted call to order and a strained smile from Diane. "Thank you all for coming out in this weather," she said, tapping the microphone. "We're aware of the recent concerns regarding the chairlift system, and I want to assure everyone that safety remains our top priority." Someone near the front coughed, pointed, not accidental. Diane straightened. "I've spoken with several acoustic specialists, and the consensus is that we're experiencing a combination of atmospheric interference and natural wind phenomena. Nothing mechanical has been found to be defective." A man in a flannel shirt stood. "Then why do people keep reporting noises only over one section? Why always the same spot?" Diane blinked. "Coincidence, perhaps. There are thermal updrafts in that area. We have charts." "You have excuses," someone else muttered. Before Diane could respond, Tom Andrews rose from the third row and stepped forward, holding a folder. His calm voice cut cleanly through the room's growing tension. "With respect, Mrs. Reynolds, the community has questions that go beyond just sounds in the sky." He turned to face the crowd. "I've spent the last 2 weeks reviewing the HOA's expenditures as well as board decisions made in the past fiscal year." He opened the folder. "There are at least 4 contracts issued without open bids, all of them awarded to companies connected to sitting board members or their immediate families. One of them, Reynolds Development Group, received over $200,000 in unitemized design fees." Diane's face flushed, but she didn't interrupt. Tom continued, flipping pages. "There's more. Budget overruns were filed retroactively, financial disclosures were skipped, and reserve funds have been drawn down without community-wide votes." A wave of murmurs passed through the room like a gust. Diane stood. "These allegations are misleading and taken out of context. Emergency expenditures are authorized under Section 11B, Tom finished, nodding. "But only for repairs or damage mitigation. A new chairlift doesn't qualify as either." Someone toward the back shouted, "How much is left in the reserves?" Tom hesitated. 18,000, he said, down from 183,000 6 months ago. That landed like a thunderclap. Another resident stood, face red. "You told us this lift would raise our home values, but rentals are down. People think this place is haunted." Laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous, bitter. Diane tried to regain control. This project was approved by the board. The board was elected. A woman in the middle row stood. "Then maybe we need a new board." Applause broke out. A voice called from the left side of the room. "What about Peterson? Maybe he's behind the sounds. He used to work in sound design, right?" Heads turned. Robert didn't flinch. He said nothing. Tom held up a hand. "Let's not turn this into a witch hunt. If you have proof, bring it forward." The man sat down, grumbling. Diane's voice rose. "We cannot allow rumors and paranoia to dictate governance." A man near the front replied, "No, but we can vote." Tom stepped to the microphone. "Then let's do that." The vote was swift. Ballots were passed, marked, and collected. Within 15 minutes, the count was read aloud. The entire board, Diane included, was removed. Tom was named interim president by majority acclamation. Diane stood without a word and walked out of the room. No coat, no folder. Just the stiff echo of her heels disappearing into the howling wind. The meeting dispersed slowly, residents buzzing in low clusters, some relieved, others dazed. Tom found Robert standing near the side door. "I suppose this was inevitable," Tom said, tucking the folder beneath his arm. "Still, there's a part of me that's curious." Robert looked at him. "About what?" "We know what you did. We can't prove it, but we also need it to stop." Robert's gaze held steady. Tom sighed. "We'll try to move the lift. It won't be easy. We'll need time. But the fear? It's costing us more than money." A moment passed between them, filled only by the wind rattling the glass behind them. Robert, with a faint smile, responds, "Then give the mountain back its silence." Some battles end in applause, others end in quiet. By the last week of February, the snow had begun to let go. Not all at once, but in subtle ways, dripping from the eaves, shrinking from the edges of driveways, leaving damp outlines on fence posts and stone walkways. The chairlift stood still during most afternoons, its towers now painted with fresh, reflective tape and new alignment markers. Workers in bright orange vests had spent weeks rerouting the path farther from the homes along the South Ridge, adding a gradual bend that carried the chairs wide of Robert and Sarah's property. No official explanation had been issued. The HOA simply stated the changes were part of a community harmony initiative. Diane Reynolds' home had gone on the market quietly. Within 10 days, a modest moving truck appeared early one morning, and by sunset, the house sat dark and hollow. No one said goodbye. Few noticed. Robert spent the thaw mostly in his workshop, though not in secrecy anymore. One afternoon, he invited 2 teenage boys from down the hill to join him, curious as they were about the old mixing board and reel-to-reel recorders. He showed them how to layer natural sound with manufactured tension, how to create unease without a single word. He didn't mention the lift. He didn't have to. Sarah had returned to her garden boxes with slow determination. She clipped back the dead stalks, turned the soil, and plotted her spring herbs on a folded piece of graph paper. On days when the sun was strong enough, she sat outside with a blanket over her lap and a mug of ginger tea in hand, watching the birds pick through last year's nests. One morning, a young girl passed by with her mother on the way to the community hall. The girl stopped at the end of Robert's driveway and looked up at the lift, now curved wide in the distance. "My uncle says it's haunted," she said matter-of-factly. Her mother hushed her gently, but Robert, who'd been sweeping pine needles from the porch, only smiled. The winter solstice gathering that year was the largest Pine Ridge had seen in a decade. Folding chairs ringed the main lodge hall, and children helped string paper lanterns across the rafters. Tables held crock-pots of chili, slow-cooked beans, and pies arranged in neat rows with handwritten labels. Tom Andrews stood near the hearth, a glass of cider in his hand. His voice carried calmly through the room. "To those who stood firm for what's right," he said, raising his glass, "who believed in privacy, community, and the kind of quiet that lets a place stay beautiful." Robert accepted a nod from across the room. He didn't raise a glass, just gave a quiet, respectful tilt of his head. Later that night, he stood on the deck as flakes drifted slowly from the sky, barely sticking to the damp planks. The air was still, no hammering, no motors, just snow. Behind him, Sarah turned off the porch light. "You coming in?" "In a minute," he said softly. He looked toward the new lift route, now lit by subtle amber bulbs that followed the rerouted line around the ridge. It moved slowly, some chairs full, some empty. There was no sound from above. But beneath a decorative rock at the edge of his property, beside the garden path Sarah would soon seed again, a weatherproof speaker remained in place. Silent. For now. The snow eventually melted, but the silence it left behind remained. In a town where power once spoke through paperwork and concrete, it was the quiet resolve of a man and a community that carried the day. Some victories aren't marked by grand speeches, but by a garden replanted, a story retold, and a path rerouted with care. When neighbors choose courage over comfort, even a mountain can remember who it belongs to. And sometimes all it takes to protect what matters most is knowing when to listen and when to stand still.